Sasa, Nunga Def, Assalamu alaikum, whatever, however you want me to come to you. Well, we're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne, the Moores Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, and a long time since we've been doing this for a couple of decades. And Dr. Horne is the author of many books, and he is, I guess, the latest one is I Dare Say. And how is that particular book doing, sir?
Well, apparently okay. I mean, they submit some money, so it must be doing something.
I think that's the bottom line. We're talking with Dr. Gerald Horne, and we're talking about Eleanor Collins. She was a singer from Canada. She lived in Vancouver, and she joined the ancestors. She was 104 years old. She had roots in Oklahoma, roots in Africa, of course, and then there was a number of African people who came to were from Oklahoma, and they came to Canada, several parts of Canada. And let me say this before we really get started. The young man by the name of Alfred W. Hamilton started the newspaper where I started writing, called Contrast. He was from the same lineage, and I didn't know this, but many of the people actually left Vancouver, and they left Regina and Winnipeg and places like that. Some of them went back to Africa. I'm not aware of that particular situation, but Miss Collins was a great singer. She passed away, and let me be frank with you, Dr. Horne. I didn't know that much about her because it was in the lull period. She was really big in the 50s and the 60s, and I guess she started to wane in the 70s in terms of popularity. But she had her own TV show even before Nat King Cole had a show on was it NBC, CBS, one of the American stations, NBC, I guess. And Nat King Cole lasted for her show started on CBC in 1955. Dr. Nat King Cole, brother from Alabama, his show was in 1956. She outlasted Nat King Cole, and she was a great, I wouldn't say a stylist. I guess some critics called her a combination of Sarah Vaughan and Ella Fitzgerald. Dr. Horne, have you ever heard any of your music yourself?
Well, yes, and one of the reasons why the obituary in the New York Times piqued my interest is because the writer said that her family had left Oklahoma as part of the so-called Great Migration.
Right.
And that struck me as being a bit odd because the Great Migration is usually associated with Black Americans in Dixie moving northward to Chicago,
right? Yeah.
Detroit, New York, etc. And of course, in my book on Texas, there's a lot of Oklahoma history in that book, since the two states border each other. And I wrote in that book about how Black people in Oklahoma, which had once been a Bantustan, so to speak, the land of the Indians, the United States drove many indigenous nations away from the eastern seaboard and told them they could live in Oklahoma for as long as the river shall flow and the grass shall grow. But alas, per usual, the United States did not keep its word, and in fact unleashed a reign of terror, causing many Black people to move northward to Alberta in particular, and then, as you suggested, on to Africa. And so I wrote a note to the New York Times suggesting that they revise their obituary, but we shall see what they will do, although I tend to doubt if they'll follow my lead.
Well, let me tell you this, Dr. Horne. There was a sister by the name of Phyllis Marshall. Now, Phyllis Marshall was well known in Toronto. She had her own TV show, and at one point she was called the Eleanor Horne of Canada. She actually had a recording contract with Columbia Records. She's on YouTube. She had her own show, and she was very close to. I shouldn't say close. She was one time she was her and Leonard Johnston, the owner of Third World Books and Crafts. They were I guess they went together as young people, but Phyllis Marshall was we knew about Phyllis Marshall because at one time in the 70s, when you walked into the CBC, her photograph was all over CBC, and what's her name, Miss Collins, was she was about your complexion. No, she was a little bit lighter than you, but Phyllis was a lighter skin, and both of them were. Beauty is a subjective situation, but both of them were stunningly stunning. But Phyllis, for some reason, Phyllis Marshall got all of the play, and I guess one of the reasons I don't know that much about Miss Collins is because you have people when they peak, when you run out of style under capitalism, they basically obscure you or forget you. But the research that I've been doing about Ms. Collins is that she was quite a force. Like I say, her TV show lasted longer than Nat King Cole, and as you know, and as many of the listeners of this show know, that Nat King Cole had longevity. I mean, there's stations in according to George Ware. He says there are stations in South America, you might hear Nat King Cole music all day because, Nat King Cole recorded in Spanish, many of the songs in Spanish.
And just one final point, Eleanor Collins was reluctant to go on the road because she had a family. She had a brood. And you oftentimes find that right? With artists, they don't want to go on the road. They don't want to move to New York. They don't want to move to Los Angeles. And that tends to curtail their artistic careers, which is a loss. It's a loss to those artists who have talent, who live outside of New York and Los Angeles in particular.
Well, she reminded me, and I don't think she really wanted to put up with all of the she had to be makeup and all the pretty situations. Like I remember when I interviewed Billy Ocean the first time, and Billy Ocean had, at the end of his, Billy's still in the land of the living, but if you see Billy Ocean today, he has dreadlocks and he has gray hair, and he was laughing at me and laughing. He was saying, these people actually want me to dye my beard. He said, I'm not ashamed of having gray hair. He said, but basically, they put a gun to his head and told me, when you're going to get out on the road and tour, you got to get that gray out of your beard and your hair. He was basically saying that he wanted to be, if his hair was gray, then so be it. Let him be himself. And today, he is himself. And as everyone knows, that Caribbean Queen, let me say this and I'll shut up. Caribbean Queen was originally called European Queen. And when they changed they put the Caribbean part to it, it still took off anyway. But, capitalism, they wanted to sell songs to Europeans or to white folks. And so they called it European Queen. But when they changed it to Caribbean Queen, as they say, the rest is history. And you're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. You have some questions, Melinda?
Yeah, we have a big list. So do we want to backtrack and talk about China and Mexico?
Well, yes. As you know, the Trump team put tariffs on goods coming from China. He pledges to raise the tariffs, particularly against electric vehicles, which are intimidating the North Atlantic camp. Germany is worried that BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes are in jeopardy because of these reasonably priced electric vehicles from the People's Republic of China. So China's invested heavily in Mexico. There are hundreds of Chinese corporations right across the border in Mexico. And needless to say, it's causing quite a bit of hysteria in the United States. And speaking of hysteria, there might be in motion as we speak a shift in U.S. imperial geostrategy. What I mean is, just the other day, President Zelensky has offered to negotiate with Russia based on the 2022 borders before the special military operation. We see the flap between Netanyahu and Biden and the attempt by the U.S. administration to dislodge Netanyahu and replace him with Benny Gantz, who is no prize in terms of Palestinian rights, but the cosmetic change may give U.S. imperialism some breathing space in that hot part of the world. And all of this seems to suggest that the Biden team is going to ape the Trump strategy, which is to cut losses all over the world, negotiate with Russia, and focus like a laser beam on China. And that brings me to the fact that recent reporting has suggested that there are U.S. forces 10 miles off the coast of China on an island that Taiwan claims. There has been reporting that, at least in the past, there were nuclear weapons from the United States on Taiwanese soil. We all know about the jousting between the Philippines, a U.S. proxy, and Chinese vessels in the South China Sea. And President Marcos Jr. of the Philippines has just visited Germany, amongst other European states, trying to round up a posse against the People's Republic. And so the situation with regard to China is coming to a head. And it makes all the more curious what we've complained about more than once, which is the fact that many of our Black friends here in North America are echoing the anti-China sentiment, perhaps unwittingly, being manipulated as useful idiots in order to inflame the atmosphere against Beijing. And I should quickly say, of course, that we have been in the forefront of castigating Chinese policy going back to the Entente, the anti-Soviet Entente of the 1970s, which actually has now put China in the catbird seat, since as a result of turning against Moscow, they received massive foreign direct investment from the North Atlantic camp, which has now created this juggernaut. And so now U.S. imperialism wants to undo what in some ways is its handiwork. So it's a very perilous and dangerous moment that we face right now. But I'm afraid to say that, per usual, I don't see that much commentary amongst our friends in the Black movement here in North America about this combustible situation.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. I wanted to move on to Senegal. And Senegal, they had the elections in Senegal, and we have a new president-elect. But before I talk about that, Senegal, you talk about the Black people in the Western Hemisphere, the whole question of Senegal, very important country. And, some of us opposed or not really impressed by Leopold Senghor, who was the leader of the organization, the party that led Senegal to independence. He claimed to be a African socialist, and he put together this concept called negritude, which really was Secretary was very critical of Senghor, and could you talk about the whole concept of negritude and people like what's his name, Malefi Asante is a proponent of negritude. He used to travel with a former president of Senegal, Wade. Gerald used to talk about Wade, President Wade, a lot, but could you talk about the whole concept of Leopold Senghor, negritude, and what that means to the African world?
Well, whatever merit that the concept of negritude was said to possess, the fact is that Senghor was a neo-colonial puppet in many different ways. Certainly, he was a master of the French language. Certainly, it's fair to say that those interested in the proper elocution of French would oftentimes consult Mr. Senghor because of his mastery of that language. But this also ties into the present, because with regard to the election of the new president, fine, a lot of the reporting has said accurately that Senegal has not had a history of military coups, unlike many of its neighbors. But one of the reasons for that is because France didn't have to use the military to overthrow the regime, because the presidents were in the French back pocket, and that starts with founding father Leopold Senghor. So I would like to caution and warn the new president in Dakar to be alert to what's happening in his military, that France is known to interfere in a muscular fashion in the internal affairs of its former colonies. I would also like to, as they say in the United States, perhaps Canada too, get into his business, because he has two wives, one of whom is, shall we say, more traditional than the other, the latter spending a lot of time coming in and out of France, and for what it's worth, straightening her hair into flowing tresses. And the experience that we saw with Jacob Zuma in South Africa, who had, I'm not mistaken, 4 wives, suggests that that is a particular facet of a leader's life that can be manipulated, and President Faye should be on guard with regard to that, because France is not happy right now with regard to what's going on in this former colonies. In fact, as we said a few weeks ago, it might help to explain why the president in Paris has been so boisterous lately, threatening to put thousands of French troops in Ukraine, for example, which could be a trigger for World War III. And he's said to be doing that because he's upset that as France retreats in Africa, he perceives that Russia is advancing in former French colonies. We shall see if that takes place in Senegal, because the new president in Senegal has been quite critical of France. He threatens to withdraw Senegal from the so-called CFA, the currency in many of the former French colonies, which in many ways is a subsidy from Africa to France, believe it or not. And if that subsidy from Senegal to France is curtailed, that may mean that France may have to raise taxes on the wealthy, which is something that the president of the rich, speaking of President Macron, would prefer not to do. So we need to keep an eye on Senegal, and not only keep an eye on Senegal, but extend solidarity to help to prevent this ambitious new president. After all, he's only 44 years old, the youngest head of state and government on the African continent. We need to protect this new regime, because they may need it.
Let me say, isn't the brother from Burkina Faso? Took over, but isn't he the youngest leader in Africa, a Touré?
Well, I'm just going up on reports. So although I'll bend to your superior wisdom, he was born in 1988, which means 22, that means he's 46, if I'm not mistaken. And I just said that the president of Senegal is 44.
Oh, no, you're right.
I'm not a mathematical whiz, but the last time I looked, 46 is more than 44.
Yeah, I can see that, my brother. Melinda, you have another question?
Yeah, let's go to the U.S. and Israel rift.
Oh, I stand corrected, Norman. He is younger than President of Senegal. I was not being modest when I said I'm not a mathematical whiz, so I misstated and misread.
How old is he?
According to Wikipedia, he's 36.
Okay. Yeah.
But then again, I'm not sure what his official title is. They list him as interim leader. They don't list him as president. They don't list him as prime minister.
That's
so,
right,
you know, that detour set aside, once again, Israel is in the news because of a threat to intervene on the Rafah crossing into Egypt. The fact is that Mr. Netanyahu was about to undergo a major surgery. It would not surprise me at all if he does not exit from the operating room totally intact, to put it mildly. He's under fire. His strategy now seems to be to attack across the border in Lebanon and Syria, and perhaps try to draw Iran into the conflict, perhaps try to, by that maneuver, get the United States to come on board, which would distract the United States from China, which is, as noted, the major goal right now of U.S. imperialism. So we've said before that we may be at the beginning of the end of the entire Zionist project, and Mr. Netanyahu is doing little to dissuade us from that opinion.
I think you mentioned Zuma. Has he been disqualified as a candidate for the South African elections in May? Is that true?
Well, that's what the headlines say, and we'll see if he appeals and what happens with the appeals. As I said a week or two ago, and this is why you have to sort of keep up, is that relations between Washington and Pretoria are headed to the basement. And in fact, let me point your audience to a new book by the Yale scholar Johnny Steinberg, which continues the attack on Winnie Mandela. That's nothing new. I mean, she's been attacked repeatedly, sometimes legitimately, sometimes not. But what he does in this book is attack Nelson Mandela. And up until this point, the attack on Nelson Mandela had come from folks like Julius Malema and folks around the economic freedom fighters, younger people in South Africa who did not live through apartheid, who felt that Mandela was not tough enough at the negotiating table. But of course, he was not negotiating as an individual. He was negotiating as a leader of an organization, the African National Congress. He was negotiating against the backdrop of a changing international scene with his major ally in the Soviet Union collapsing, along with East Germany, which probably per capita contributed more to the anti-apartheid struggle than the Soviet Union did. His hand was not strong, but you can't necessarily expect people to make criticisms while being aware of larger issues. But in any event, in this latest book by Steinberg, Mandela is really eviscerated. And it's a major bestseller here in the United States, not necessarily because it's being bought by Black people. It's won book prizes, not necessarily book prizes authorized by the Black community or the left community, for example. And I think that this attack on both Mandelas is symptomatic of this downturn in relations, an attempt to discredit the post-1994 regime, as a way to interfere in the May 2024 elections. So it's a very serious situation. And I just hope and trust that our friends are aware of these developments, and so that they can adjust their line accordingly.
Let me say that my as these people say in the southern part of the United States, myself and my mother, we used to have heated debates about Winnie Mandela. My mother couldn't stand Winnie because she said that woman, Winnie, he killed that boy Stompy. And she could not stand Winnie Mandela. And I was saying, I don't know, if that's true or not, or what the situation was, but she had a hard line on Winnie Mandela. Then on the other side, you had people that loved Winnie Mandela. I think was it Betty Shabazz? Who was the one that remember? Was it Betty Shabazz that hugged and grabbed Winnie Mandela when they were in New York? Was that Betty?
Probably, but Winnie Mandela is a controversial figure. I mean, rest her soul, and she apparently gave this author a lot of ammunition by which he sought to indict her. As a matter of fact, a lot of his critique of Nelson Mandela comes from situations whereby he was trying to bail her out, literally and figuratively, out of dilemmas in which she found herself, which, according to the author, including what might be called some unethical fundraising from various corporate investors in South Africa to get money to handle with Winnie's various legal cases. It's a real assault. It's a real attack. And once again, I don't think we should just see this as the product of a single solitary author. We need to put it in a larger, wider context. But as also noted, this cloud may have a silver lining, because in order to undermine South Africa, it seems the imperialists are trying to improve relations with Zimbabwe, trying to improve relations with Angola. And it's up to the comrades in the southern cone of Africa to put their heads together and adjust strategy accordingly.
We're opening up the baseball season is opening. I don't know if you want to deal with that, or is there anything you want to conclude with, because we only have, I think, 4 minutes, if I'm right.
I think maybe talk about March Madness, because we're winding down March.
Well, Connecticut on the men's side seems to be in the driver's seat. We shall see. On the women's side, University of South Carolina, the two USCs, University of Southern California, University of South Carolina, the former with Juju Watkins of South LA, who is a legitimate star in the making. And the University of South Carolina, their coach, Don Staley, is probably the best coach on the men or women's side with regard to basketball. And let's see what happens. And of course, you may want to add a note before we leave about Jonte Porter of the Toronto Raptors, who is out of action because of investigations concerning gambling. That particular enterprise has entered sports in a big way.
I have never bought a lottery ticket. I know nothing about gambling. I never played African golf, as my uncle would call it. Never shot dice. I have, as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin once said, only Allah knows. I have no idea. I don't know about what he's doing with that. I don't follow. I don't even follow the gambling situation. Money's too. I need, like John Whitehead once said, I need money bad. So I don't be. I've never, like I said, I never even bought a lottery ticket.
Well, you are somewhat singular because this is a multi-billion dollar, perhaps a multi-trillion dollar industry. Actually, it's another way to loot the working class because house rules and all manner of interpretation of those two words. And so you're basically being looted when you're gambling. But the NBA, the National Basketball Association, has opened the floodgates. It may be possible in the very near future for you to gamble on such matters as will DeMar DeRozan make his next free throw, or such matters as will Toronto Raptors make the playoffs, or will they win their next game? It's really getting out of hand. And of course, that brings us to the Shohei Ohtani scandal, quote unquote, in Los Angeles with baseball Dodgers, where his interpreter come manager lost almost $5 million in Ohtani's name, paying off a bookie. Apparently, Ohtani was unaware. So gambling, if these professional sports are not careful, they're going to end up like professional wrestling. That is to say, a sport that you don't take seriously. And in fact, I should also mention that J.B. Bickerstaff, the coach of the Cleveland Cavaliers, has said the gamblers have been calling his phone, threatening him, for example, threatening his family. Tyrese Halliburton of the Indiana Pacers, star player, is seeing a psychologist because he says that all the attacks on social media by gamblers is driving him a little batty. So this is a very serious situation, and I hope your fellow Canadian, Jonte Porter, is able to escape unscathed.
Let me say this last thing. There's a place called the Casino Rama in Ontario, which has they have concerts and they have gambling, and they have buses that leave from Toronto where you can take these buses. And when you take these buses, they are packed with Filipinos and African people, Caribbean people of African descent. And you go there and they take you there and they bring you back at 2 in the morning. And I guess you come back at 4:30 or so, and they are packed with, like I say, Africans, from the Caribbean and Filipinos, and they don't go to those. They don't necessarily go to the concerts. They're going there to gamble. It's big, like you say.
Well, on that note,
that's it. We'd like to thank you, Dr. Horne.
Thank you. Good luck. Bye-bye.
And I would like to thank Lisa Watson, and also I'd like to thank Melinda Francis. And as we say, we will see you, everyone, in the whirlwind.